Hello, everyone. Peter Maravellis here. I hope this finds you all safe and well in these extraordinary times. On behalf of City Lights booksellers and publishers, I'd like to welcome you to City Lights Live, the virtual reading series that continues in the footsteps of our in-store calendar during the time of the pandemic. We continue to celebrate the works of authors we know and love with readings, discussions, and forums moving into the new year. I'd like to take a second before we begin to remind you that City Lights stores remain open during the pandemic to the public. We're following strict San Francisco Health Department guidelines, and we aim to make your visit as safe as possible. You'll once again be able to browse our stacks. Our business hours are 7 days a week from 12 noon to 8 p.m. We have worked very hard to transform the store for the age of COVID. The entrance is now on the Broadway side of the building. It's actually at 271 Columbus. The original entrance is an exit only. We do encourage everyone, please do wear facial covering while visiting. We are making our efforts to keep things as safe as possible for everybody. As many of you know, City Lights is a publishing house as well as a bookstore. We continue to publish in the grand tradition of Lawrence Ferlinghetti's seminal Pocket Poet series. I might add, Lawrence will be turning 102 years old in March. It's really quite something. We continue to produce on a seasonal basis new books of poetry, fiction, literature in translation, and nonfiction informed by a progressive political outlook. We have new titles forthcoming from Tim Wise, Caribbean Fragoza, Tim Miller, Seshu Foster, as well as many others. To learn more about the books that we publish as well as our up-and-coming events, do visit our website at www.citylights.com. You can also keep up on our activities via social media. We have a presence on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, you name it, we're there. You can also subscribe to our newsletter to receive weekly updates about new City Lights releases, as well as our up-and-coming events. So we are greatly honored to have with us tonight two very exceptional and courageous journalists. We've been following the work for some time now, so it really means a great deal to us here at City Lights that we can celebrate the launch of Nicole Perlroth's new book. It is titled, "This is How They Tell Me the World Ends, the Cyberweapons Arms Race." It is published by our friends at Bloomsbury Books. It is a truly astonishing feat of journalism based on years of reporting and hundreds of hours of interviews. It explores in depth the untold story of shadowy cyberweapons markets and their relation to global warfare. This is a subject of utmost importance as the consequences of accelerating technological advances race beyond any kind of easy comprehension. This is a book that can really help us create a kind of a baseline for understanding the levels of complexity that are inherent to cyber warfare and help us become aware of the urgency needed to come to grips with it. So a few words about our author. Nicole Perlroth covers cybersecurity and digital espionage for the New York Times. She has covered everything from Russian hacks of nuclear power plants, airports, and elections to North Korea's cyber attacks against movie studios, banks, and hospitals, and much, much more. She has done much to expose the new face of warfare in our times. A Bay Area native, Ms. Perlroth is a guest lecturer at Stanford Graduate School of Business and a graduate of Princeton University and Stanford University. This is How They Tell Me the World Ends is Ms. Perlroth's first book. We are greatly honored that she has graced our virtual halls this evening to launch this really remarkable work. Joining her in conversation is none other than David Sanger. Mr. Sanger is a national security correspondent and senior writer for the New York Times. In his 36-year reporting career, he has been on 3 teams that have won Pulitzer Prizes, most recently in 2017 for international reporting. His newest book is titled The Perfect Weapon: War, Sabotage, and Fear in the Cyber Age. In it, he examines the emergence of cyber conflict as a primary way large and small states are competing and undercutting each other and changing the nature of global power. So before we begin, I'd like to mention that we will be posting links for you to purchase books in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard. There's also going to be a Q&A at the end of the evening. You may also post your comments and questions in that same chat function. I will collect your questions and forward them to our authors. There isn't going to be any chatting between and posting of comments, unfortunately, this evening. We're just going to be receiving questions, but you will be able to see the link to purchase the book. So it is such a great honor to have both of you with us here tonight. Nicole Perlroth, David Sanger, welcome to City Lights Live.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you,
Peter.
Great to be with you. And,
Nicole, I think we lost your image.
Yeah, it says you have to. Hi, everyone. Thanks for the lovely introduction, Peter, and thanks to everyone who's joining us tonight. I know that there's a lot going on, and the last thing you want to do is stare at another screen, but I really appreciate all of you joining us. And this is my first event for my book tour, and I'm so excited to be talking to my cyber compadre, as I call him, David Sanger. So, David, take it away.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining us. Before I ask the first question of Nicole, I just have to tell you, you heard all of her qualifications. I have to tell you a little bit about what it's like to work with Nicole each and every day. It's a great joy. We make each other laugh a lot from two different coasts as we try to go piece together the Silicon Valley and cyber side of what is happening with the national security side of things, which I cover from Washington. And it's a really great partnership, which stretches back even before the Snowden documents together. But right around the world and given us another really difficult topics where when you're writing it in 1,200 word segments and so forth, you may or may not hold on to your reader. And what Nicole and I have both discovered is that there is such a fascinating backstory behind the people, the governments, the new way of conflict in which nations are constantly undercutting each other and advancing their own power using cyber as the primary weapon to go do it. So 2 years ago, I worked on a book about basically the geopolitics of this, and got turned into an HBO documentary that came out last year. But Nicole, you were a lot smarter than I was, and you thought rather than deal just with the nations, the conflict, that kind of battle, you would actually go focus on the cyber arms race, the search for zero-day flaws, vulnerabilities that people had never seen before. So tell me first, why did you do it that way? And why didn't I figure that out first?
Well, I think, I had, coming from Silicon Valley, I had heard these murmurings of a gray market for 0 days. And just to back up for a second, these 0 days is just a flaw in software that can be exploited for all number of purposes. It could be exploited to spy on your text messages and listen in on your webcam or your video feeds. It could be exploited to steal passwords. It could be exploited to drop a cyber weapon into a nuclear plant, as David has covered really well in his previous books. So I had heard these murmurings that governments actually paid hackers for 0 days. And I never really, you and I actually wrote one story about how there'd sort of been the proliferation of these markets abroad. But what really opened my eyes was in 2013, I was invited to do a story off some of the Snowden leaks with one of our other colleagues, Scott Shane, at the time. And a lot of the general reaction to the Snowden documents, a lot of people were upset about the phone call metadata collection program. They were upset about the secret court orders that whereby the government was going to tech companies and getting information about their customers' data without customers knowing about it. But what struck me in the Snowden documents were these sort of littered references to backdoors, implants, and 0 day exploits that the NSA was getting from somewhere else. And they weren't clear exactly where these were coming from. They made mentions of their commercial partners and their security partners. And I wondered if what I was seeing was evidence that there was a lucrative gray market for these 0 days. So that started me off on this project. And I ended up spending the last 7 years trying to piece together every piece of this market. When did it start? Who are these brokers who go out and pay hackers to turn over 0 days and then give them to government agencies? Doesn't this leave all of the rest of us vulnerable? Because, 30 years ago when this started, we were all using different technologies. So if a hacker sold the government a 0 day in Huawei software or software used in Russia, and that was fine because no harm, no foul, Americans use something different. But what struck me was that there was this real moral hazard in that now we're all using the same technology. We're all using iPhones and Androids, and whether you know it or not, we're using Microsoft Windows, not just for our everyday communications, but we're rolling it into our critical infrastructure. So if the government finds a hole in those technologies that we use here too, how do they decide whether they're going to keep that in their arsenal for their espionage and offensive cyber operations? And when do they decide they're going to turn it over to the company? And so that was sort of the goal with the book. And what I found was that, yes, the US pays hackers for 0 days in a lot of the technology you and I use every day, that they've been stockpiling these things for a long time, and that the secret was sort of out of the bag. And over the last 10 years, other governments have joined the scene. Other governments have started paying hackers for these same 0 days. And we no longer control this market. And so where is this all going? It's going to the place that you and I know because we cover it every day, which is more attacks happening all the time, and increasingly on our critical infrastructure.
Well, Nicole, I think one of the remarkable things about the book, and I, live and breathe this stuff, and yet I was learning a huge amount about it, was the degree to which you were able to explain how the US government essentially becomes the junkie for these 0 days. And of course, having created the market, then gets very upset when they discover that other countries, including our adversaries, or criminal groups, or terror groups, or teenagers, are exploiting these 0 days as well. In other words, when we do it, it's a patriotic act to advance the cause of the nation. And when everybody else does it, they're awful hackers who ought to get indicted or taken off the battlefield, the cyber battlefield. So not surprisingly, given the controversy around this, it is not easy to get hackers to go talk to you. But you managed to go do it. And you describe in the book the difficulties along the way, going to a conference in Argentina, I think it was, where half of them thought that you were an FBI agent, which, by the way, if you know Nicole, is a hilarious thought. Okay. Okay. And the other half, in this sort of very male-dominated bro kind of culture of the hackers, were sitting there trying to pick you up. So how did you wend your way between those who thought you were the narc and those who thought that you were actually interested in talking to them for other purposes, into actually getting to reveal their lives out here?
It's a great question. So, the Argentine thing is so funny because just since the book has come out, a lot of the Argentine hackers I spoke to said, "Oh my God, I thought you were a CIA agent. I would have told you so much more had I known." But I'm not a CIA agent. And I really just had to do what we do all the time, which is figure out what was public and sort of peel the onion back from there. And what was public wasn't very much. There had been a few stories about one guy had come out and said that he sold 0 day exploits to government. He sold this code. And he even posed for a picture in Forbes magazine sitting next to a giant duffel bag of cash. And after he did that, no one ever did business with him again. He was a pretty famous guy. He's on Twitter. His name is the Gruk. He's a South African guy, lives in Thailand. But he became this warning case for everyone else in this market. If you ever talk to a journalist about this business, no one will do business with you. I think even the Thai police showed up at his house. So, you're going to put yourself at risk. No one has any incentive to talk to a reporter and talk about a business that essentially deals with secret espionage code that once gets discovered gets patched and is worth nothing, because essentially a 0-day, once it gets discovered by a software maker, let's just pick on Apple, Apple will find a fix for it, roll out a patch, you'll get a software update, you'll roll that out, and then whoever was using that for espionage loses access. So we're literally talking about code that is closely guarded, because the minute anyone finds out about it, it loses its value. So there had been a company back in around the early 2000s that decided that it was going to start paying hackers for these 0 days. And the reason it was going to do this is because it had customers at banks and governments, and it figured that if they paid hackers to tell them about these bugs, then they could offer their customers something of real value in terms of showing them what software or hardware was vulnerable and where they could potentially have vulnerabilities, and where they could have a workaround to sort of work their way around these vulnerabilities so that cyber criminals couldn't target their networks. So they started paying hackers. They as far as they knew, there was no other market out there. They came up with this very quaint price list, paying hackers $75 for this bug, $100 for that. So I went and talked to them about how they came up with this process and how they made this decision to start paying hackers, and all the flack they started getting from tech companies that were saying, why are you inviting hackers to get into our systems? And in those days, this was early 2000s, late 90s, tech companies, when a hacker approached a tech company and said, hey, I found a giant hole in your software and I can use it to get into NASA's network, the tech company's perspective on this wasn't, thank you so much. It was, stop playing around with our software and shut up. And maybe, they'd even send their general counsels after these people. So I started talking to this company. They were called iDefense. They'd started paying hackers. They were not popular with the tech companies. And they noticed something was changing. They noticed that all of a sudden, it seemed like overnight, hackers started saying, hey, that bug that I said I was going to sell you last month for $10,000, I want $150,000 for it. They started saying, I'll only give you this bug in Microsoft Internet Explorer browser for no less than $90,000. And at that point, iDefense had only paid as much as $10,000 at the most for a single bug, but most of them were going for $500. And then iDefense started getting these calls. So the CEO told me he started getting these calls from men from companies he'd never heard of. Most of them were boutique defense contractors. And they basically made him a pitch, which was, if you sell us those bugs that you're buying for $500 and don't tell your customers about it, and don't tell the software manufacturers about it, we'll give you $150,000. Think of the profit margins, that would be amazing. And he started getting more and more of these calls, and it just blew his mind that anyone was willing to pay 6 figures for something that they were only paying $500 for. And he made this decision that he was not going to sell these bugs under the table for 6 figures, because he'd ultimately be working against his customers, and then that would have been the end of his business if anyone found out about it. But after he said no, it was very clear that there was some market elsewhere for the same bugs, and that it was going to put them out of business. So he was a savvy business guy. He ended up selling this business for $40 million. And just this company story is amazing, because he bought it for $10 and he sold it for $40 million. And so
we're in the wrong part of this business.
I know, we're always in the wrong part. So anyway, I spoke with him, and I ultimately was able to get in touch with one of these mystery callers who worked at one of these boutique contractors. He would not go on the record. So if you read the book, you'll notice I had to change names twice. One of them was for this broker. But he was a military guy, and he basically walked me through the history of the market, which was, very early on, government agencies wanted a way to get into adversaries' networks. They wanted to spy on terrorists. They wanted a way to spy on the Russian embassy in Kiev. And the best way to do that, they discovered, was a 0-day. And so they paid this guy's small boutique contractor to develop, 10 0-day exploits. And the exploits are just the code to exploit a 0-day. So these guys started, searching for bugs and systems and writing the code to exploit them and selling them to governments. But very quickly, they realized that there were hackers all over the world finding these bugs. Why didn't they buy them from hackers, write the code to exploit them, and then they would sell that to the government agencies? So those early days were just straight out of a spy novel. This guy told me stories about paying Israeli middlemen to go over to Eastern Europe. And, he'd go over with this bag of cash, because in those days, that was how they were paying for these things. And they would pay these Eastern European hackers, $150,000 for a bug. The guy would bring back, the knowledge of how to exploit the bug. They would write the code to exploit it, and they would sell it to government agencies. And most of their biggest customers were the Pentagon and, to a lesser extent, law enforcement agencies. And they got away with this for years. And after 9/11, there was almost this sort of virtual stampede from government agencies to these defense contractors. They could not get enough zero-day exploits. Just like you said, they were really junkies for these things. And so for a long time, the US government essentially spawned this market, was paying hackers elsewhere. And this is how they were getting those tools. And what happened next was Stuxnet. And you can talk about Stuxnet because you wrote the book on it, David. And David is also the first person who disclosed the real name of Stuxnet, which wasn't Stuxnet, it was Olympic Games. But Olympic Games, or Stuxnet, was an attack that the US and Israel did in Iran on a nuclear facility, where essentially they used code to take out Iran's centrifuges. And that attack was still to this day is the most sophisticated cyber attack that you or I have covered. And the short term, it was wonderful. Long term, unfortunately, the computer worm escaped Iran's Natanz nuclear facility and allowed everyone who knows anything about code to dissect it, to see what it had done. And it opened these other governments' eyes to the potential of a zero-day exploit. And since then, it has just been a giant cyber arms race for governments all over the world to acquire these tools, some cases for espionage, but a lot of these governments are using it to spy on their own people, to spy on journalists, to spy on their Twitter critics. And a lot of them are stockpiling them to potentially cause real destruction. And David and I have been covering some of the more destructive attacks recently, but every attack, it seems, just escalates off the next. Every single attack we cover is almost like a deadlier or more destructive attack than the last. And so that's why I'm writing this book now, or putting it out now.
Let's talk about that escalation, because as you say, it's the intersection of where my book left off and where yours picks up here, because Olympic Games, which was the government's code name for it, wasn't just the use of 4 or 5 0 days in one program. It was that in that case, the exploiters were 2 presidents of the United States, right? George W. Bush and then Barack Obama. Bush handed this program off. And Obama, sitting in the Situation Room in just about 10 years ago, said to his staff at one point, one day all this is going to get out. And when it does, every country in the world that wants to go attack us or is attacking us anyway will use it as an excuse to just accelerate their work. They'll say the Americans are doing it, why not us? And that's pretty much how it's played out and how it plays out in your book. After Olympic Games and the U.S. destroying about 1,000 of the Iranian centrifuges, and the Iranians recovered, as we can all see from where their program is now. The Iranians turned around, they attacked Saudi Aramco, the biggest oil producer. Then they attacked the U.S. financial system in 2012. Then one day, the big conservative donor named Sheldon Adelson, who just passed away a few weeks ago, an owner of a bunch of casinos in Las Vegas, declares that the way that we should deal with Iran would be to drop a nuclear weapon in the desert and tell them that the next one's in Tehran if they don't give up their nuclear program. So they look around and they say, Adelson, desert, guy owns some casinos. Be a shame if the Sands Casino computer systems melted down too, which is exactly what happened a few weeks later. So tell us a little bit about how the market is now feeding itself, why this is accelerating, and is there anything we can do to get off of this sort of constant rat race of keeping the wheel going?
Well, I think what our adversaries have figured out is that when it comes to cyber, they have a real advantage on us because these attacks don't cost nowhere near the amount it would cost for them to try and compete with us on the physical battlefield. And even though, I want to be fair to the United States here, we are the most advanced cyber superpower in the world. We have been for a long time. The Stuxnet Olympic Games attack is the most sophisticated attack in history. Nothing has ever come close. That said, our lead is slipping, and these other governments have seen what can be accomplished in cyber. Now, we might be the most advanced cyber superpower in the world, but we are also the most frequently targeted nowadays. And also, we are the most vulnerable because we are so wired up, because we made this decision as a country that we wanted to basically make everything as convenient and as accessible as possible. We sort of bought into the Silicon Valley promise of a frictionless society. Now, the problem with that is that all of this remote access we've set up, it's not just, us Zooming right now, it's a water treatment facility that doesn't have the resources to have someone sitting there all the time, that outsources some of the work of supervising their systems to contractors who live miles away. They've given them that access, but that access can be exploited by a hacker to essentially cause destruction. So starting after the Saudi Aramco attack, that was the big one that took everyone by surprise. And my favorite fun fact from that attack is that the Iranian hackers who pulled it off, they didn't just wipe out Aramco's data. They actually replaced it with an image of a burning American flag. It was like, Iran's here, we're coming for you next. And the next thing that happened was they came for the Sands Casino. And after that, they came for one of our dams. Now, it's a funny story because they actually got into the wrong dam. They got into a dam that David played in as a 10-year-old in New York called the Bowman Avenue Dam. And David could have told them that there's no water in that, holding that dam back.
At least there hasn't been for the past 55 years. The main thing that would happen if you would go to that dam is that you get chewed out by your mother later on because they were afraid you'd like fall off. And there was just nothing but sharp glass and rocks underneath it. Yeah.
Right.
So somebody really needed to tell the Iranians to pick their targets a little better.
Right. And the story I heard was Michael Daniel, who was then Obama's cybersecurity coordinator at the time, got the proverbial 3 a.m. phone call from John Brennan, the CIA director at the time, freaked out that someone was in the Bowman Dam. And now it turns out there's 2 Bowman dams. One is the one that has no water in it in New York. And that was actually the one that the Iranian hackers had gotten into. And they were mucking around with the controls that control the locks on that dam. But there's another Bowman Dam in Oregon that holds back what, if they had breached these locks and let go of the gates using these remote controls, would have essentially caused the equivalent of a tsunami using code. So they were totally freaked out, but within an hour, they discovered actually it was this little tiny babbling brook situation and not the real Arthur Bowman Dam in Oregon. And so they were able to recalibrate their response. But what that showed was that Iran actually had the intent to muck around with our critical infrastructure. And we don't know if they made a mistake or they were just scanning around and found some open port somewhere and it happened to belong to David's playground when he was little. But things have escalated since then. And, these days, Iran is now widely considered, any security researcher you talk to will tell you that they are our most prolific adversary in cyberspace. They are probing American companies. They've been probing internet service providers to get into all of their clients, which number in the millions in some cases, and they've been probing our critical infrastructure. And they also play in this zero-day market. So we can pick on Iran for a long time, but they're a really good example of how an adversary has basically elevated their cyber expertise in a way more quickly than we anticipated. And here they are these days probing our infrastructure. Now, they did back off at the end of the Obama administration after we struck the Iran nuclear deal that David covered. There was a little bit less Iranian activity, but once Trump ripped up that deal, we saw them reemerge in a big way. And so these are sort of the adversaries that the United States is facing these days. And when we hoard a 0-day in our own technology, in Windows, for example, the problem with that calculation is Iran is looking for that 0-day too. They understand that a lot of our critical infrastructure relies on a few key technologies software. It relies on Microsoft Windows. It relies on Siemens software that goes into our industrial control plants. It relies on Schneider software. And they are probing these systems too, as are Russia, which was able to get into a petrochemical plant in Saudi Arabia and dismantle the safety locks that prevent an explosion. I mean, we know that these adversaries are really experimenting and testing our critical infrastructure. And so while we haven't had that big life-threatening attack that some officials have called a cyber Pearl Harbor, we are inching dangerously closer to that attack.
Nicole, how would you like to have been the manager of the hacking team who had to go back and explain that they had the code right, but they hit the wrong Bowman Dam?
I know.
It cannot be career enhancing. So another way that we see these used at times is in a piece of criminal activity that may sometimes hide state activity, and it's called ransomware. Where somebody comes in, locks up your computer system and says, if you want the keys to get your data back, send your Bitcoin to the following anonymous location. That suggests, since most of this is done by criminal groups, that the 0-day market, which was fed by governments, is now being fueled by criminals who figure out that, it's a lot safer and probably more profitable to go lock up the city of Baltimore, the city of Atlanta's computer systems, or some company's computer systems, than to go out and deal drugs on the international market.
Yes, that's right. I mean, ransomware has become such a big problem. It was something like 600 towns and cities and schools have been hit with ransomware in a 6-month period last year. The most frightening ransomware attack recently was one I covered in Vermont, where they wiped out patient records, but they could still see patients. That's what we think of when we think of a ransomware attack. We think, well, fortunately, they can still see patients. But the problem is it wiped out things like the chemotherapy protocols, right? So there are these complicated protocols that they use to deliver chemo treatment to cancer patients. And the ransomware attack totally obliterated these records. So people were coming in for their routine chemo treatments and they weren't able to get them because nurses and doctors didn't have a record of what they had been given. And they were sort of trying to do it by memory. But, we've heard that that's resolved, but I think it's just a really glaring example of how dangerous these ransomware attacks have become.
So Nicole,
David
I'm
and
sitting
I,
in Vermont
sorry.
as we do this, and one of the mysteries of this case is who thought they'd actually make a whole lot of money doing this? I mean, they hit a regional hospital up near Burlington, but not a wealthy hospital. It's not in a particularly wealthy area. What's the motivation for grabbing the records, especially if you think that the target isn't going to be able to send you a duffel bag full of cash or Bitcoin?
Well, unfortunately, what we've learned is that a lot of the victims pay. because it's a lot cheaper to pay even a couple $1 million Bitcoin ransom than it is to start from scratch. And I think, in Baltimore, I forget what the ransom demand was. Do you remember, David? I think it was in
It was
the
pretty
thousands.
vague was the problem. And in the end, I'm not sure we really understood what kind of ransom they were looking for.
They didn't pay, was the bottom line. They didn't pay what the ransom demand is. And I think the ultimate tally for what they had to pay to basically rebuild their systems from scratch was something like $18 million. I mean, it vastly exceeded whatever the ransom demand was. And a lot of these victims at hospitals, there is urgency to getting their data back. They also, a lot of victims we've learned have cyber insurance, and insurers have calculated that it's cheaper for them to pay cyber criminals ransom demands than it is to pay for their clients to essentially
But that
rebuild
only
these things from
feeds that only
scratch.
feeds them to go do it again and find
It
another
only
customer.
feeds, right, exactly. And so it's become this hugely profitable business. We've seen a lot of cyber criminal groups that used to profit off the sale of malware and personal data theft and credit card data theft moving to ransomware. Now, where it got pretty fuzzy was before the election. David and I both heard that one of the concerns within the Department of Homeland Security was that Russian cyber criminals, because a lot of this comes from Russia, we actually know that they design their code to avoid hitting any computers inside Russia. And they were targeting municipalities. And in one case, we know from some leaks that happened, they got into the Secretary of State's office in Louisiana. And then they waited 3 months and hit the Secretary of State's office the week of I think it was their governor's election. And that totally freaked out the FBI, because basically they said, if this is the playbook, if they're getting into these systems and then waiting to detonate ransomware for the week of the election, there's a pretty good chance they're going to come for the 2020 election. So David and I started covering the threat of ransomware to these elections. And one of the things that was really interesting and also sort of terrifying, but very fuzzy at the time, was what was the nexus between Russian cyber criminal groups and the state? Because there had been several attacks where there had been indictments. And one of the most famous had been the attack on Yahoo, the technology company, where ultimately they pinned the blame on 4 people, 2 of whom were FSB agents and 2 were Russian cyber criminals. And the FSB agents allowed the cyber criminals to essentially mine these systems for profit, steal people's passwords and sell them on the dark web. And then they would hand off the really interesting accounts, people who worked at the White House or the State Department, they would hand over access to their accounts to the FSB agents. So we know that they work very closely together. And the fear going into the election was that basically cyber criminals would be assigned to detonate their ransomware on these crucial election systems that would keep people from casting their ballot or checking in at the polls or keeping Secretary of State's offices from certifying the results. Now, ultimately, that didn't happen. Fortunately, David and I were both on these calls with the Department of Homeland Security on election day, and Chris Krebs, the now fired leader of CISA, the cybersecurity agency within DHS, ultimately concluded that day that it was, quote, just another Tuesday on the internet. And now what we've learned is the election was always a distraction, and Russia wasn't coming for our election. They were actually at that point inside our federal IT networks, which is the attack David and I have been unwinding right now at the New York Times.
So let's talk, before we get to questions here in a minute, Nicole, let's talk a little bit about that attack, which is called the SolarWinds attack, because it went after a piece of network management software that most people had never really focused on. I know I had not, before the Russians got into it. And this is software that basically is used by big Fortune 500 companies, government agencies, to balance the load in their computer systems. We use it at the New York Times to manage our systems, both internally and as readers and subscribers come to get their news. And a big news day like today with the impeachment hearing on, you've got tens of millions of readers coming. You got to balance all that out. But what the Russians did in this case was so sophisticated, Nicole, that I have to ask you whether you think it's a move beyond 0 days. They got into the update system in the software. This software code gets improved and updated every couple of months, just like your iPhone gets a new version of the software every couple of weeks. You plug it in on your bedside table, and overnight, Apple or Google, in the case of the Android phones and so forth, it introduces a new version of the software. Now, when you get up in the morning, Nicole, I know that even though you've got a child to feed and things like that, that you go through your phone to go through every line of code to make sure nobody introduced any new flaws into it, right? Now, we've never done that. That's what the Russians understood. They got into the system. It then called back to servers that weren't in St. Petersburg or in Moscow. They were here in the United States. And so they knew they could avoid the National Security Agency. What does that tell you about where this is headed? Because they did something that didn't really require 0-day flaws. They kind of created their own code to go into the update.
And that is why it is such a terrifying attack and why it's such a big deal. And why I say that the United States lead in offensive cyber warfare is slipping, because for years, and David and I covered an attack, people talk about Huawei, just a small tangent here. People talk about Huawei being a backdoor for China. David and I learned and broke the story several years ago that actually it was the NSA that broke into Huawei and were using Huawei to spy on Huawei's customers in places like Syria and Sudan and China and North Korea. So we've been doing these attacks for a long time. And now what we're unwinding, what we're seeing is that Russia is doing to us what we have long done to other countries, which was this super stealthy attack using our own American software, getting into the software update. And why should these clients at government agencies and SolarWinds, the company was used by more than 400 of the Fortune 500. They were used at the NSA, they were used at parts of the Pentagon. Why should they distrust this software update? They just downloaded it and rolled it out into their systems. 18,000 companies and government agencies did. And from there, what Russia did was they picked the most interesting ripe targets, and then they crawled around and planted their back doors into their networks. And now what we're seeing is that the Department of State, the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security, the very agency charged with keeping us safe, the Department of Energy, its nuclear labs, were all targeted in this attack. What we don't know is whether utility companies were also affected, because a lot of them used SolarWinds software. But in sort of diving into this attack and looking back at SolarWinds, which is a Texas company, they're based in Austin, what David and I learned was this company had really shoddy security, even though its software touched some of the most sensitive networks we have. They were building, most of their build operations were overseas in Eastern Europe and places like Belarus. That's where they were building their code and testing their code.
And come on, Nicole, tell everybody what was the password to get in and affect the updates, because you actually
were the one who brought
this.
It was SolarWinds 123.
Boy.
It was SolarWinds 123. And they also had no way to patch for vulnerabilities. These days, a lot of sophisticated technology companies like Microsoft and Apple and Google and Facebook invite hackers to test their software. And when hackers find a bug, they pay them for it. That's the 0-day market. That's sort of the technology companies coming to meet the 0-day market head on. SolarWinds didn't do that. And actually, when you look back at their security track record, hackers were finding some really heinous problems with the company's security. We also learned that there was a guy, they had a security guy on staff that was warning the company as far back as 2 or 3 years ago that if they didn't make a bigger commitment to their own security, that the implications were going to be catastrophic. And we're seeing that catastrophe play out right now. And we are just learning about the beginning of this attack, but really Russia was inside these government agency systems as far back as almost a year ago. And by the time they were discovered, they had like 9 months to plant backdoors elsewhere. And I think it will take months, if not years, for us to confidently say we've eradicated every Russian backdoor in these systems. So unfortunately, I hate to say it, but we're a little bit screwed right now. But coming back to the 0-day market, you're right, this had nothing to do with the 0-day market. Where the 0-day market really comes into play is with adversaries like Iran, like North Korea, like other adversaries we don't even know their names, who don't have the skills of Russia, or even maybe China or Israel or the United States, but can essentially buy their way into these capabilities. And so where I see the real threat from the 0-day market, it's that it's closing the gap between what the United States and Russia and these top tier nation states can do and what these sort of bottom feeders can do. And it's really helped close this capabilities gap. So, that's how that feeds in.
So Nicole, before we go to questions from the audience, one last brief story you have to tell everybody. It's our encounter with Donald Trump on this beat.
Yes.
It's all yours.
So David came to me and said, I've heard that there was a change in the authorities granted to Cyber Command. Cyber Command is basically the group at the Pentagon who now pulls off our cyber attacks. And under Obama mandated that he needed to personally sign off on every attack that Cyber Command did. Under Trump, they changed these authorities. And at the time it was Bolton. And they changed the authorities to allow Cyber Command to pull off attacks without the president's knowledge or authority. So David came to me one day and he said, I've heard that there is this shift in authorities. I haven't fully grasped it, but I understand that it's being used to basically greenlight Cyber Command's attacks on the Russian grid. And so the two of us parted ways, called up every source we had, and within a couple months, we confirmed that yes, the authorities had changed and Cyber Command has been hacking the Russian grid in a very loud fashion, almost to make a show of it. So we reported this story and we had this little line in the story that some accused us of burying, although I don't think we did, where we said that not only were we doing this, but we went out of our way to not tell the president about it at the time, to basically keep this from President Trump, because Cyber Command and some of his own national security advisors were worried that Trump would countermand these attacks. So we reported all of this.
Because they were in Russia. And
yes,
he didn't believe he would not want to offend his Russian friends.
That's right. And the last time Trump had some sensitive information about some things that we were doing and some key tips from allies. I believe that it was Israel, but I don't know if we've confirmed that. The last time that happened, Trump told the Russian foreign minister on his visit to the White House. So there was real concern that Trump would try to countermand some of these operations. So David and I did this story, and I'd love to hear where you were when this happened, David, but I actually went on a bike ride one day and I was biking around and I noticed that my phone was buzzing. And when I finally got home, I saw that I had something like 20 text messages, all of them screenshots with Trump calling what our story was of, quote, virtual act of treason. And, at the time we had been, accustomed to the failing New York Times and the enemy of the people. But to my knowledge, it was the first time Trump had used the word treason to describe journalists at the New York Times. Do you remember when you were,
I was at dinner and one of our lawyers called and said, have you looked at the president's Twitter account? I said, it's a Saturday night, I'd rather not. And he said, well, in this case, you might want to go off and do so. And then there was a discussion about whether a virtual act of treason was the same thing as an act of treason that takes place virtually. Because after all, this attack was a cyber attack. But we decided that that was probably a distinction lost on the president. Later on, about a half an hour later, he sent out a second tweet because somebody must have wandered by and said, you realize that by sending out the first one, you're confirming their story. So he sent out a second one, which in all caps read, and it's not true. And I remember the next Monday saying to some of the National Security Council staff, you guys are going to have to choose. Either it was an act of treason, in which case I guess you have to send us off to the Justice Department, or it wasn't true, in which case the story was false, but it couldn't be treasonous by definition. Which one is it? They never answered. I'm not sure they knew.
Well, and I actually realized I skipped over an important part of the story, which was you went to the National Security Council before we published to tell them everything we had in the story. And usually when that happens, there are some, complicated discussions that happen. For instance, when I was reporting on some of the Snowden documents, they asked us to leave out certain things and we went back and forth and we had these discussions and ultimately we published most everything we knew. But in this case, what happened? What did they say when you went to the National
They said,
Security
we have no
Council?
problem with you publishing the story because they wanted the Russians to know we were inside their grid because, of course, the Russians are inside ours. Well, Peter, we could go on with this forever because we do it every day.
It's a pleasure.
We
I'm
thought that
enjoying it.
maybe we should let the audience come in with a few questions.
I do have some questions. So Javier asks, how do you see ransomware moving into new technologies like autonomous vehicles?
Such a good question. It's such a good question. That is why that is totally possible. And I mean, you can imagine that being the new car theft. Suddenly you can't get your Tesla to start and you get a ransom note on your Tesla display. That is a very real threat. And one of the things I learned in the process of doing this book, which is just, a technical detail, but I thought it was really interesting. The Tesla these days has 100 lines of code in it, more than a US fighter jet. And
Not
the
100,
ability,
100, you said
million
100.
lines, sorry, 100 million lines of code, more than a US fighter jet. And so, finding a vulnerability in 100 lines of code designed by humans that make errors is not impossible. And so it is a very real threat. And it's not just autonomous vehicles, it's sort of everything. As we migrate to automated transportation, as we move to the self-driving cars, as we basically put software in our airplanes and air traffic control, all of that is, it's totally possible to be held up with ransomware. But right now, there's just so much money to be made on the low-hanging fruit, that being American towns, cities, hospitals, and schools. They haven't gone there yet. But it's not because they can, it's just because they haven't had the incentive yet.
Cool. I have a question from Carrie. It's a two-part question. What is the Biden agenda for cybersecurity? And then part two, what is it like to be a woman working in the field?
Well,
I might let David take the Biden one.
I'll
because
take the
he
first
just
one.
wrote a story
I'd be a
today.
poor one at the second question. So let me do the first one. So we're learning along the way. The first thing that Biden did was during the transition, he stood up and said, we've got to get to the bottom of this solar winds thing. And on the first week of the new administration, he created a new deputy national security advisor in charge of cyber. This restored a big office that had been less influential in past administrations and eliminated ultimately in the Trump administration. But just yesterday, the head of the Senate Intelligence Committee, a Democrat, Mark Warner of Virginia, wrote a letter saying that he thought that to the White House, saying that he believed that the response to the Russians and solar winds was, in his words, disjointed and disorganized, to an administration that has only been around for 3 weeks as of today. And they sort of came back and said, no, it's not disorganized. Here's the person who's running the operation. It's a woman named Ann Neuberger, who we've covered quite extensively along the way, used to be at the NSA. And it's going to be really interesting in solar winds to see Biden set the precedent by how he responds to the Russians. On the one hand, it would be easy to say we're going to be a lot tougher than we've been before, since we haven't been very tough before. On the other hand, as Nicole just said, we don't really understand how deeply into our networks the Russians are. So you may not want to escalate this cyber conflict until you understand what the Russians can do back to you.
So, okay, great answer, David. Yes. And it's going to be very hard to figure out how to respond to something when you don't know how deeply Russia's inside our own networks. And also, how do you respond to something that you do quite frequently? So here is the answer to the women in cyber question. And I'm so glad you asked, Carrie, because I was on Fresh Air today with Terry Gross, and she asked me this question. And they had to cut it, I think, for space for more important things. But it's horrible. The short answer is being a woman covering these issues is horrible. For one, whenever I hear people complain about the ratio of females to males in tech, I just have to laugh because it's way worse in cyber. I go to these hacking conferences and I'm usually one of 1 or 3 women who cover these things, but everyone else for the most part is male. I don't know why, but for some reason at these hacking conferences, there's always jujitsu tournaments going on. I don't know why, it's just really popular with hackers. They tell me it's the physical equivalent of a puzzle. So that's what they're doing in the off hours, you know, which is not really great for me to try and source with people. And, you know, in general, it's just a very male dominated, it's a very male dominated industry, and it's full of a lot of egos that bruise very easily. And I'm not only a woman, I'm not a coder, I'm not a computer scientist. So I really come at this as a layperson, and I have to translate everything they do for our readers at the New York Times who know nothing, you know, in a lot of cases, many do, but about computer science. So it's really tricky. And I think one of the trickiest parts is translating what I hear from the hacking community for the lay audience. And a lot of people hate the way I translate it and think I dumb it down too much. And I hear about it on Twitter all the time. And so, and I always say Twitter is now the worst part of our jobs. I mean, the amount of criticism you get as a journalist on Twitter is astronomical. And a lot of it is not the fair criticism. It's, you know, people taking your face and putting it on a meme and making a meme out of you. So it's not that fun. But the best part of my job is that I get to work with David and with, you know, the guys in our national security team and with the Washington Bureau. And I really feel like it's true that we are covering the first draft of history when it comes to cyber. Every day, something new is happening. And usually there's a whole new geopolitical context to it. And so it's almost like, you know, we're in speed school, like we're just in college again. And you're just learning new things about the world every single day. And yes, it has this terrifying quality to it, but you know, it really feels like what we're doing is important, and that's sort of all you can ask for with your work. So that's
No,
the
I'd give a
answer to that question.
slight amendment on this in Washington, because while the coding world is full of these jujitsu bros, in the policy world in Washington, in cyber, there are a lot of women now. And it's interesting that when the Biden team is sort of all put together, if you believe both the who's been appointed now and who's rumored to be, the 2 top cyber officials in the White House and the Senate confirmed position that just got created by new legislation are both going to be occupied by women who've had extensive national security experience. That doesn't make it any easier at the hacker conventions. Although I've been wondering why it is that Nicole's been practicing jujitsu all these years. Now I understand.
So I have a question from Abby, who asked, what is your advice to the listener regarding cybersecurity? How much of your
Oh, sorry, Peter, you cut out a little bit. Do you mind just
Sorry about
repeating
that.
it?
Let me try again. So Abby asks, what is your advice to the layperson regarding cybersecurity? How much of your life do you put on your devices and how do you protect them?
Great question, Abby. I just tell people, think about what it is you have that a hacker might want. So for me, it's my sources, and so I just take extra precautions when I'm communicating with sources. And I know David has a lot of stories about this, but I'll meet my most sensitive sources without my devices. I'll bring a pen and paper. When I go travel to these hacker conferences, I bring a burner laptop. And I actually tell the story in the book about how I still felt unsafe using the burner laptop. So I put it in the hotel safe in Buenos Aires. And when I came home, the safe was open and the laptop was in a slightly different position. And all my cash was still there in the room. So it wasn't like it was a thief. Someone had been trying to tamper with the laptop. So really, I put my most sensitive communications on pen and paper. And, for most Americans these days, it's your passwords, it's access to your bank account, it's your personal data. And the best thing you can do is the most boring, annoying thing, which is come up with long, different passwords to different accounts. Don't use the same password to different account or to this. Don't use the same password for your bank account and your email account and your trading account and your Robinhood account and your Uber account, because chances are likely that at least one of those passwords is sitting on the dark web somewhere. And then the other thing is use two-factor authentication. Go look in your settings, opt to turn on two-factor authentication. So anytime someone tries to log into your accounts from a strange device, they won't be able to without the second password. And that is really important. And it sounds really lame, but it will knock out 75% of the threats you probably face. So do those things, and you won't be defending yourself against Russia and the people behind the SolarWinds attack, but you'll be defending yourself from sort of the low-hanging cyber criminals that just want to grab your bank account info.
Well, with that said, we have essentially run out of time, but really this has been so eye-opening, and I'm so grateful to both of you. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, David.
Thanks so much, Peter.
Thank you.
Thanks, David.
Thanks, Nicole. Talk to you tomorrow.
All right. Bye, guys. Thanks, Peter.
Bye.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.